the trap you'll almost get stuck in at first because you're trying to just get the data right is you're just too focused on data that lends itself to the short term and not really that big picture agency data that is super important in the operator role.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. We've got a real treat today for you because we have the newest team member at Parakeeto joining us today on the show. Her name is Kristen Kelly. She has been here as a consultant for, how long has it been now? 2 months?
About 2 months, yeah.
About 2 months. And it's been an exciting 2 months. I have to say, you've been ramping up incredibly quickly. I think that's helped partly because you were very active in the Parakeeto, ecosystem prior to joining the company. So it's been really a lot of fun. So I guess to start, I'd love for everyone to get to know you a little bit, Kristen. Who are you and where did you come from?
Yeah, thank you, Marcel. So I'm Kristen Kelly, and I've been agency side for the better part of about 20 years. And I worked with 6 agencies during that time, small and large. And a lot of that is in account and project management. But my most recent role prior to coming to Parakeeto was director of operations at a small startup agency, actually. And really, that is where I fell in love with ops. And I think it really played to my analytical strengths, but also just leveraging so much of what I've learned in terms of, leadership on the delivery side. And, best of both worlds, ops is such a multifaceted and linchpin role, but as we all know, it's also full of challenges. And I know we're going to get into some of those today, how to get around some of those and work with them, lean into them.
Yes, that is the topic du jour. Ops is one of those really unforgiving roles, right? Because it's very opaque. What does that actually mean? What is the scope of that job? And I'm sure if you ask 10 different ops leaders at 10 different agencies what they do every day, you'd probably get 10 fairly different answers because it's very situational. And so it kind of puts you in this position where you have to be a fairly T-shaped person. And often you're having to spend more of your time in the areas of the business is weak to try and compensate for that. And in many ways, develop expertise and try to build that function in the business and then back yourself out of it. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is the data side of that. You often end up being voluntold to solve this really nuanced problem, which, I talked about on LinkedIn recently. We don't really know what it's called, but it's this job of sitting between the day-to-day operations of the business, the financials of the business, what's happening on kind of the new business, and trying to bring all of that context together to help answer the questions that people are asking themselves every day about are we making money? Do we need to think about hiring people? Do we need to think about laying people off? What should our budgets look like? Are we on target for things? All the stuff that you're doing every day in the business, but you need data to support. And that is a really tricky job.
To say the least, yeah. I mean, I think a hallmark of an operator is often, researching and listening to use cases that have worked in other agencies. And that really gets kind of wild when you get into the finance side of things because there are just so many metrics and so many different takes. And really what you end up kind of doing, sometimes if you don't have a finance background, is just kind of cobbling together this POV that's, aimed at trying to arrive at a reporting structure, enabling your executive team, your leadership team to make the right decisions. So when I first came across Parakeeto, really what drew me to that was just how simple it made things. And we like to say, it's simple, but not easy, right? So the framework that we've got going on here, that's really comprised of, getting the right data, having a framework to use it, and then also the process around it. That three-pronged approach really spoke to me. And, here I am today. So
Hey, here you are today. Yes, helping other firms implement it. And so I think I'm excited about this conversation because, just a few months ago, you were the person that's probably listening to this interview right now inside of an agency, trying to figure this stuff out, probably feeling like you're failing a little bit, or at the very least, you're kind of flailing, trying, grasping at straws, trying to pull together what everyone else is doing, feeling confused, maybe a little bit frustrated that like you install something or you make a tweak to the reporting system, and then you realize like, oh shit, now I have to rethink all these other pieces, and there's a lot of rework happening. And there's all kinds of reasons why this stuff happens. And I think we're going to start unpacking some of that now. So why don't we start with just so everyone has some context, how, tell me a little bit about in your past roles, what it felt like to try and start solving this problem, and what some of the challenges were that you started feeling as you lifted up the hood on this, can of worms, essentially.
yeah, well, you certainly hit. I was having like maybe a little PTSD, something like that. As you were listing all these emotions, for sure, because you hit all of them on the head. I think what happens a lot in the operational seat is you kind of get, as you said, voluntold, or really just kind of handed some instructions from your executive team that what they're looking for is for just all the systems to talk to each other and just to get some just sweeping visibility across the agency, very broad strokes, and or they want like a scorecard, right? Just whip me up a scorecard of some sort to look at this stuff really easily. So kind of like, okay, they really don't have that same point of view because, and rightfully so, they're leaders of the company. But we all know as operators, that's really easier said than done, and you have to kind of break it down into micro chunks in order to make that happen. And it all really starts with the data, and so that starts being challenging at the root because you've got systems that are already in place, like your project management system. And I think because of the way those platforms are marketed, I think it can often lead to some misconceptions from the executive leadership perspective in that, these are the magic tools that can automatically sync with each other, talk to each other, give me this visualization that's going to make this decision very easy. And it's just not really the case. And it's very hard to convince them otherwise, though, because of the marketing on these platforms. So really, as an operator, you kind of have to not only be doing the legwork and researching all of this stuff, but you also have to be able to articulate up the chain, what the reality of the situation is and, a plan forward. Yeah.
This really speaks to, there's two kinds of conversations that we're typically having, when new clients, potential clients reach out to us. In some cases, we're hearing from the CEO of the company. And the story I'm often hearing from them is, I've been trying to get my COO and or my CFO to solve this problem for a number of years. And we put lots of time and energy into it. And it's still not happening. Why can't they figure this out? And then we have to kind of try to explain to the CEO, like, you should never have asked them to do this in the first place. You're setting them up for failure. This is not a reasonable ask. And it's certainly not reasonable to expect them to do this off the side of their desk. And we, have to try to open their eyes to like why this is so nuanced. And the way that we usually, open that conversation up is saying, I'm guessing you're experiencing this, and this, and this happened. And then, you installed this new tool, but then it broke all these other things. Like, yeah, how did you know that? It's like, oh, because we've seen this before. But the challenge there is often that is a bit of an inflamed situation. So when the CEO says, hey team, we're bringing a consultant in, those two stakeholders can often get very defensive. And then that's a whole other set of conversations that we need to have to say like, no, you're not failing. You were set up for failure. This isn't a good use of your time. And really, like, you're better off getting this data and going and doing the actions that should be happening based off this insight. And then the other side of the coin is the opposite, where the operator or the finance person is so sick of trying to figure this out and realizing that it's much more complicated than they thought it was going to be. They come to us and say, I would really love your help to figure this out, but I have to convince my CEO that they should pay a third party to help with this instead of just expecting me to do this as the scope of my job. That's also a very difficult conversation to have, but it speaks to, I think, a lot of the misconceptions around this. And so I want to just start listing off like some of the things that people don't consider when this starts to happen, right? So we talk about there's three major pillars to this being a high functioning part of the business. We need the data. So number one, are we producing? There's really four sets of data: data about people, data about projects, time tracking information, and then financial, reports and budgets. And so nuance number one is the correct metadata available in all of those data sets to be able to answer the questions that we want to answer? So really simple example. Executive leadership team says, I want to know which one of our product lines is more or less profitable than the other. It's like, okay, well, are we demarking every single project against what product line it belongs to? And is the same thing true about every time entry? And do we have a way to segment our financial data that way? And if that isn't already true, and if we don't have a way that we can historically go back and clean that up, that answer is not available to us. It just isn't. The data doesn't exist. And this starts to touch on one of the other nuanced components of this is not sequential. These things are interconnected, which is why you end up feeling like there's this game of whack-a-mole that's being played when you go, oh shit, okay, let's install this data schema. And it's like, oh, well, that also is now changing all these other things downstream. So, that's one example of around data. It's like, okay, we have all this data being produced, but is it structured properly? Does it have the right metadata? Is it being consistently produced? Are the cadences aligned? Right? If we want a weekly measurement of a metric, well, is this data being produced on a weekly basis? If not, what is the cost and complexity of speeding up and aligning all the cadences? So, that one's nuanced. Then the framework, it's like the metrics. I mean, we've had this conversation a million times. Let's measure utilization. Great. Easy enough. What the fuck is utilization? Right? What is capacity? Does it include time off? Does it not include time off? What about sick days? What about PTO? What about all the internal stuff? And you have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, all with different perspectives, all with a different idea of what job that metric is even being hired to do. And that can turn into hours and weeks of debate. And then 7 different versions of utilization because no one can agree on which one it should be. And so that is incredibly nuanced. And every decision that's made on every metric forces you to reconsider how the entire system works. And then the thing that nobody wants to talk about is the process, which is, hey, guess what? The data is going to be messy. And the harder you try to get people to put things in perfectly, the lower your time tracking compliance will be. So you can't win at that game. So how do we build a system that assumes data is going to be messy? Well, I'll tell you one thing. It's not by just throwing raw time tracking data into a report. That's not going to work, right? So we need a step where the time tracking data goes into some kind of an environment where we can look for errors, clean things up, stitch data sets together, maybe normalize data from 3 different time periods where the structures were different or the tools were different. Maybe build and transform data into sets that can inform reports. So we have a time tracking by week, time tracking by month, capacity by week, capacity by month, right? We need these sets of data to be created. And then we need to manage against change. We're going to want to change tools. We're going to want to sell new things. We're going to restructure the team. We're going to change naming conventions. The PM team is going to want to set things up a little bit differently in ClickUp. So how do we make sure that doesn't break everything? And then finally, cadences. We want to measure utilization. Okay, well, that can't be measured in real time unless the team tracks their time in real time, which they don't. So what is the frequency and what's our process for making sure we get all the time in, we reconcile it, right? So it's like on the surface, let's measure utilization. It seems so simple. And then you start really understanding what are all the things that are involved in these 3 things? And all of a sudden you realize, actually, there's a lot that goes into this. And it's not a step-by-step process. You have to consider all these things throughout the entire implementation process. I have been doing a lot of talking. I'm going to stop now. But my sense is that this is reflective. A lot of these things and realizing them as you go is part of your experience trying to figure this out for the first time.
You are 100% correct. And it's like slow realization after realization. And that really kind of took me the better part of a year to kind of unpack sequentially a lot of these things. And I think it almost takes that long for someone who's trying to do it themselves, because the trap you almost get stuck in at first, because you're trying to just get the data right, is you're just too focused on data that lends itself to the short term and not really that big picture agency data that is super important in the operative role, right? So it becomes almost too micro focused on, even though, uncovering your delivery margin and the efficiency of your delivery operation is super important. It's not laddering back up to the levels of data that you need to be able to make informed decisions and have good conversations, make good recommendations to your executive leadership. Yeah. So I'm curious, Marcel, like it's almost a mindset shift when it comes to, the executive leadership team. I don't think a lot of them understand that that they are building a data operation as opposed to just kind of getting reporting together, I guess is maybe the perception here. It's like getting our system straight, but really it is more than that. And I think the huge piece that most people don't get, and I think operators included sometimes, is that getting the data correct, getting the input correct, and even understanding how flawed it is to think that your time tracking data or data from any other source might be a little jacked up, not perfect, and maybe lead to some bad decisions if we don't clean it or monitor it. So, wanted to get your take on that and really how Parakeeto kind of views that and what we're able to do to help.
Yeah. It's a great question. And this is, I did a whole link. It's funny. I did a LinkedIn post on just about everything we're going to talk about. So follow me on LinkedIn. I did a post recently, right, about this, some of the fallacies that exist when people are dreaming up, like, how will this system work? And there's so many things that sound great in theory, but in practice are completely unrealistic. And so, one example is, we're just going to automate taking all of this raw data and putting it straight into a report. And in some cases, that's like, oh, we'll zap your, all these individual tools into a report. Great. Or it's the idea of like, oh, we'll just use an all-in-one tool that automatically, we just pull reports for these things. And of course, the underlying thing that is just never true is that the data inputs are going to be perfect. And the flaw in that system is that you don't have a step in the process to do something about that. And if you go upstream to like the enterprise level, there's no enterprise organization that has, a functioning data operation. That's just like pumping raw data. They have data pipelines. They have data engineers, data scientists, data analysts. They have people reviewing this data. They have rules to transform and stitch and normalize. And there's entire teams of people, often millions of dollars in budget allocated to these teams. And their entire job is just to manage the data operation within the organization. And I think that this is just a new idea for us because we've never had access to this much data and we've never been forced to pay this much attention to it in order to survive and have margin. The second big thing is this one is really, really hard to unpack, especially when you have a project manager that has like become the operations lead, is everything should connect from top to bottom. So I want to be able to like draw a straight line from the net profit of the business to the net profit of every single project. And again, that theoretically, when you don't think about it very long, sounds great. But then in practice, when you really look at what would that mean, it's completely unfeasible. And it fundamentally doesn't make sense at some levels. And I think the simplest way to describe one of the problems with that is the concept of a reliability block diagram, which is that a system is only as reliable as each individual piece of the system. And so it's like, if I want to build my system out of 1,000 little tiny blocks, and each of those 1,000 little tiny blocks have a 1% chance of not being accurate at any given moment in time, then there's a 0% chance that my system is accurate at any given moment in time. And now anytime I need to change something or I need to maintain something, that surface area is spread across 1,000 little pieces. And so when you think about that from an operations perspective, it's like packing a whole bunch of detail into the little building blocks that make up a high level metric often mean that you have an incredible amount of time being poured into just like trying to keep the data up to date. And therefore it's never up to date. And therefore you actually fail to get to the outcome that you're looking for. And so those kinds of things, I mean, we could go on for an hour on this and we won't, but those kinds of things often get missed. And it's really, really hard sometimes to let go of these things that theoretically make sense, but in practice don't work unless you try to go down that path and then realize for yourself that in practice they don't work. And then often that's when we talk to someone that we spoke to a year ago that said, oh, I'm going to try to do this on their own. And then they come back and say, yeah, we tried that. We left another $1 million of profit on the table. We're no further ahead than we were. We've lost 2 project managers because of all the change management. Maybe it's time for us to really do something about this.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Oh my gosh, everything you said just spot on. And it does require buy-in and kind of getting everyone unified from the finance side, ops, and executive leadership to just really kind of embrace this understanding of what you've just outlined. And I'm curious too how you suggest to teams, how do you align them around, this framework that we've got here at Parakeeto that also relies on a universal understanding of certain metrics and how they're applied to that data?
Yeah. I think really the fundamental starting point has to be, what are the questions we're trying to answer and why? And if we can really get clear and aligned on that, then we have a frame for the conversation of why. Like, for example, let's say the question is, what work is more or less profitable, between projects or service lines or whatever, or maybe are we charging enough for things, right? So those are good, important questions to answer. Well, when we have that clarity, then we have a frame for the conversation of, well, is net profit the right way to measure that? What might all the problems with net profit be? Are they actually an accurate answer to that question, or are they actually making it harder to answer that question in an accurate way? Without an agreement on what question we're actually trying to answer, that conversation is completely untethered. And I'm sure you've sat, just like I've sat, in conversations like that where you get an hour into it and everyone's pissed off. And then you all realize, like, oh, wait a second, we're trying to answer two completely different questions here. So I think that's the starting point, right? Is what is the question and how exactly are we defining that question and the answer to that question? And more importantly than all of that, why are we asking that question in the first place? What decision, what change, what action should this lead to when we sit down as a team or when we open up the report to try and get that answer? And if we can start there, everything else gets much easier downstream.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges I also have seen is, the executive team placing, for obvious reasons, a lot of trust in their financial and accounting team. And they've got a certain framework of their own in terms of reporting back and what insights are shared and what terms are being used. And so what would you say to, executive leadership who, may need to kind of think about that in a different way, frame that differently in order to bridge the gap between that we're looking to bridge here, between all these different functions?
Yeah. I would say the first thing to consider is, what is the job that you've hired your financial team to do? And a lot of times the primary job that they're beholden to is tax and governmental compliance. And it's important to understand that that is a different job and a different outcome. And the way we're going to structure financials, the way we're going to do bookkeeping, the way we're going to accrue cash or, accrue income and expenses is going to be materially different in a lot of cases than if the job of the accountant was, help me make business decisions. It's really important to understand that those are very different jobs. And this is why in enterprise companies, they always say you have three sets of books. You have the tax books, and the job there is minimize our taxable income as much as possible. So we're often intentionally trying to obfuscate how profitable the business actually was, so we pay as little money to the government as possible, right? That's legit, but that's a job, and it's a specific job. The second set of books is reporting to external stakeholders. So especially if you're a publicly traded company, but even if you have a board or you have investors, or maybe even you're presenting findings to your team, you might use GAAP accounting. And GAAP accounting, again, is designed to do a specific job, and it's not designed to tell a professional services firm how their business is performing. Again, there are going to be serious trade-offs to trying to follow strict GAAP accounting. But again, that's not the job that's been hired to do. It's been hired to report in a standardized fashion in these very kind of strict institutionalized ways of reporting. And then the third set of books is what we would call management accounting. And I would say that that's much more what we're focused on at Parakeeto. And the job there is, can we use this information to make better decisions in our business? And the key thing there is, are the structure of these reports and metrics and how information is being accrued reflective of the model of our business and how it actually works? And when we actually earned this revenue, when we actually incurred these costs, like, are all these things aligned? Are they accurate? Are they properly structured? And it's much more nuanced often, because we need to be able to understand, how does the business actually work? And this is where it gets a little tricky. The vast majority of accountants don't have the scope, nor do they have the interest or the expertise to be able to do a good job of management accounting. There are some out there, and we know them. We're friends with them. I'm happy to tell you who they are. We could probably even leave some of them in the show notes. Shouts out to all those great people that come from the agency background. But if your accountant has never worked inside of or run an agency or professional services firm, there's a really good chance that they're not going to be effective, because you need to be able to understand the business. You need to start to be able to take into account capacity, time off policies, time tracking, projects, the billing model for those projects, how work actually gets done. And those things are generally way outside the scope of what finance is comfortable or even willing to go into. So the big idea is, there are different ways of doing accounting. There's a really good chance that your team is doing a different job than you're asking them to do, but that's never really been an explicit discussion.
Yeah, I think you've just highlighted exactly kind of the disparity between really what the executive team usually has at their disposal, which is, a very specific accounting approach or financial approach on one side. And then they've got just some other tools like their CRM, their project management platform, a couple other things that manage their business day to day. That's, how do you reconcile those two? And that's exactly what you're kind of talking about here. And so, let's say, this agency, aligns all of these once siloed entities. And, what kind of processes do you recommend and cadences to have in place in terms of reviewing all of these insights? And, how do you recommend that agencies get into a good standard rhythm for just sharing and, collaborating across the board?
There isn't really a one size fits all here. I think part of the negotiation that we would go through, and this is an example of the kinds of conversations we might have when we're onboarding a new client, is let's get an understanding of what their existing meeting rhythms are around the business. Do they do annual planning? Do they do quarterly offsites? Are they having a weekly level 10 meeting? Maybe they're running EOS, right? So they've adopted that meeting cadence. Okay, great. And then it's a question of who's involved in those meetings. What kind of decisions are they making? What kind of questions are they asking? And then what data is required to support those conversations? And then that cascades into, well, what's feasible, right? So for example, if we wanted to report on our financial KPIs every week, well, the vast majority of financial cadences do not take place on a weekly basis. In fact, most financial cadences take place on a monthly basis, and they need 2 to 3 weeks to close the books. So that's a pretty big delta if we want to understand, like, what is our net profit on a weekly basis? And then the other consideration is, like, could you even accrue revenue and expenses in such a way that that ends up being even accurate and insightful to any degree? And if the answer is no, then it's like, okay, well, is there an alternative way that we can support this conversation with data that might not need to be coupled to the financial reconciliation process? So this is another big idea, but this kind of gets into, sometimes there's a lot of utility actually in decoupling these things and saying, let's not make all these ops metrics completely aligned to finances, because if we do, then everything moves at the pace of finance, which is slow and retroactive, right? So on a weekly basis, what data do we have access to that can be complete, that can be accurate? So all this to say, like, it's not really that simple. But the important starting point is really understanding, okay, what are the rhythms that exist inside of the business? And again, what questions are we asking? What decisions are we making? And then we can work backwards to what metrics best support those and how best to measure those in an accurate and helpful way.
Yeah. And I think that you've just unpacked so much nuance here, and it applies really across the board at all three of those stages. So from your data to your framework to your process. And I do think that, it's just really important for, especially the person in the operational seat, to understand all of that before going down the very painful rabbit hole of kind of dissecting a lot of this stuff, in a siloed fashion. I think that really holistically looking at that entire thing is the key to, being successful in an operational role for sure.
I will add that like I just kind of gave a non-answer and I hate it when people do that. So I'm going to try to give like an actual answer. So I've talked about how it's nuanced. There's not a one size fits all, but here's the general recommendation, right? Is finance is on a monthly basis. Now, the challenge that people have with that is if that's all they have, they're looking at their finances 2 or 3 weeks after the month is done. It's looking backwards and they go, oh, great, we didn't make that much money. And then there's not really much information as to why. So this is where we have kind of our 3 core operational KPIs, which are average cost per hour, average billable rate, and utilization. ABR and utilization being the 2 that we're going to pay the most attention to. And generally, we want to be looking at that on, let's call it a bi-weekly basis. If you can get it to a weekly basis, but those would be the things that you want to pay attention to on a tighter time horizon. And what you'll find is if you have an understanding of your model and you know that those 2 metrics are on track, then you don't need to pay attention to your finances as often because you'll know what they're going to look like ahead of time, right? You know that things are on or off track. And so you're not surprised when you get your P&L back and, things look bad. If you knew leading into that your utilization and ABR weren't bad, or you knew even ahead of all that your forecast was off and you weren't even planning to hit those targets in the first place. So, the leading indicators are the forecast, then the kind of lagging but much more timely indicators are average billable rate and utilization, and then the kind of source of truth, but happening on much broader time horizons, is going to be your financials. So that's typically how we would approach this.
Yeah, the additional context is really helpful there too. And I think one of the most eye-opening things about, when I first discovered Parakeeto was really just how much you can unlock with your narrowing the focus in on ABR and utilization as, the really powerful, indicators and drivers there. So yeah, doesn't have to be complex, but it doesn't mean it's easy. Yeah.
Yes, simple but not easy. I would love to flip things a little bit, Kristen, and ask you about, as you think about like data, framework, process, having recently been in the position of trying to sort this stuff out, what was your experience? Let's start with the data side, right? So what was your experience trying to just get all the necessary data being created and flowing in the firm? We'll start with that point. What were some of the things that you ran into or some of the questions that you had as you were going through that process?
Yeah, so I think for starters, I think that many operators encounter this, where especially with some of the project management platforms available today, is you've got your project and your time data in a central location, and generally, I think it is not a terribly hard baby step in the right direction to work on timesheet compliance and getting that data in good shape. So the low hanging fruit from an operational seat is usually getting some of that delivery data in okay shape, but it's kind of reconciling that with some additional financial layering in terms of revenue recognition and how that's spread out and accrued, smoothed out compared to the hours that are spent. It is keeping tabs on all of the pass through and just marrying a lot of things together that are not living in the same system. That's challenge number one. And just trying not to get so caught in, a myopic view of just what's immediately available to you in certain platforms from the data side. Moving on to process, I think it comes down to really just arriving among all the stakeholders at a universal understanding of what each metric is that we're measuring and why, and what it's going to ultimately help us decide or do. That was just a huge challenge, especially when it came to ABR, to be honest with you, because I think a lot of executive teams kind of think about that as, oh, it's just your rate card. It's just like, that's it. That's all it represents. When really it's a powerful metric to tell you, whether you're hitting it at various levels of the business and what that means ultimately, when you're coming in, where you're coming in with ABR. And I think lastly, the third prong of this framework of the process, it's just making sure, to your point, it fits into natural cadences. So it feels, just natural to the executive team to be looking at things at a frequency that matches the way that they're making decisions. So, the last team I worked on ran EOS. That made a lot of sense for us to, on a weekly basis, kind of keep tabs on, some of the day-to-day metrics versus, the monthly meeting where we would go a little bit more high level on agency-wide decisions based on forecasting. And yeah, just making it as seamless as possible for the players involved in the system that you're running.
Now, I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I will ask you this question, and it is very self-serving. So spoiler alert, everyone, this is a self-serving question. How much do you think it cost you to not have help on this when you were doing it? If you consider how much profit was left on the table in that business for the year that you were working on this and not solving it, plus all of the time from you and your team that went into this, plus whatever money you spent surely trying out new software platforms and installing them and all these kinds of things. If you had to guess, what do you think that total investment was across those three vectors?
Oh my gosh, it's a six-figure total for sure. I mean, you think about my salary plus the salary of others, like our MOPS person who is helping me configure some of these, cobble together some visualizations that I wanted to see from certain systems. Yeah, I mean, in the six-figure range for sure. Just like I mentioned, I think earlier in this conversation, I did spend a better part of the year unpacking a lot of this stuff, yielding some success, but really, it's not the big picture. They're ultimately, you cannot, without this holistic framework, achieve the desired result. It does not work on an individual basis to try and be doing that.
So I asked that question because I'm hoping that there's someone listening to this somewhere that is where you were in that journey a year ago, and their executive team is like, no, we're not going to hire consultants. You figure this out. Maybe just do that math and then go to them and say like, hey, we're a couple $100,000 into this. It's still unclear if we're going to get to the result, or we could go and pay Parakeeto a fraction of that and they'll just solve it. And there's no risk involved. So anyway, just my 2 cents on this. I know we got to wrap up here, Kristen. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I had a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to doing more of these together.
Likewise. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And looking forward to the next one.
Awesome. And if you're listening to this, let us know what you got from the conversation. Send us questions. We always love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.